Hi, in this video I want to talk about the Mexican military. Yes, Mexico has a military. They've got an army, a navy, an air force, even a marine corps. It's actually larger than you would probably expect it to be, even though Mexico only spends about, I think it's like 0.66% of GDP on defense or something like that. At any rate, it's actually very interesting and it's something that probably very few of us know anything about. So I want to get into it in this video. My name is Michael Shirkin and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. I'm going to divide this video into 4 parts. In the first, I'm going to look at the background, provide some background about Mexican military policy and Mexican strategic culture. Second, I want to talk about what this means for Mexico's actual military requirements. Third, I want to give an overview of the military that Mexico has with its army, its air force, its navy, and even its marine corps. And then lastly, I want to wrap it all up and talk about, well, does any of this make any sense? Part 1. Mexico's number one external security threat is, without question, the United States, which, by the way, thrashed Mexico in the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848. I think the United States walked away with something like a third of Mexico's actual territory. We're talking about New Mexico, Arizona, Texas. Why did we take Texas? California, etc. It was a really big deal, and it was really tremendously awful for Mexico and probably profoundly embarrassing. Now, what's interesting is, as far as I've been able to tell in my cursory reading about Mexican military history and Mexican defense thinking, is that the Mexicans walked away from the American War of 1846, 1848 with the idea that because there was really absolutely nothing they could do to deter the United States from making war against them or invading Mexico, the safest thing to do, the smart move, was to basically do nothing that might provoke the United States, nothing that might appear threatening, or nothing that might invite any kind of intervention. So the idea is that you focus on the internal security, you focus on your internal mess, and you try to make sure that the internal mess stays within certain limits because you don't want to give the Americans any cause for concern, because you want the Americans to not even notice you. Ultimately, I think the classic example of the sort of thing that the Mexicans have been and still are afraid of is the American punitive expedition of 1916, when there was a Mexican revolutionary named Pancho Villa who led a raid into the United States. I believe he attacked some town in New Mexico, killed a bunch of people, burned down a few things, and then the United States got all up in arms, and they sent General Pershing in with an expeditionary force into Mexico in the attempt to capture Pancho Villa. I don't even know if they succeeded. I don't really know anything about it. I just know that it's the kind of thing that makes the Mexicans very nervous. They don't want that sort of thing to happen again. I think this totally applies to today when you've got Trump threatening to invade Mexico or raid Mexico or bomb Mexico in order to deal with the drug cartels. It's clear that just like with Pancho Villa and the revolutionaries, the Mexicans have a real incentive in wanting to try to manage their problem, like the drug cartel problem, to keep things from getting too out of hand, so out of hand such that the United States feels obliged to intervene militarily in Mexico, because that's obviously not something that the Mexicans want. By the way, my favorite example of this policy and practice is the Mexican response to the so-called Zimmerman telegraph, which Germany in 1917 sent to Mexico. The Germans basically offered Mexico a military alliance in case the United States joined World War I against Germany. Germany said, hey, we can help you reconquer the lands that you lost in the 1846-1848 war. Now, from what I've read, the Mexicans actually had a little commission, military commission, that looked at this telegram, that looked at this invitation, and very prudently, the Mexican military commission concluded that the idea was insane. Do not do it. That's sort of the way they think. They just don't do it. So with this in mind, the Mexicans have consistently focused on internal security, internal stability, and interestingly, they appear to have eschewed altogether any sort of conventional military capabilities, anything that risks catching the eye of Americans and making Americans nervous in any sort of way. Mexico doesn't even publish defense white papers. It's as if they don't want to talk about such things. They don't want to talk about, let's say, what do we do about the United States? You don't want to do it out loud lest some Yankee politician notices, and then that can get you in trouble. So while Mexico has a very long military history and a very large military, and perhaps it's a competent one, although it's very hard to judge from afar and judge given the fact that it's not like they do many military operations, it is decidedly and deliberately low tech and clearly incapable of conventional military operations, which is fine because they don't need to be capable of conventional military operations. Not only that, but they think it's dangerous to be capable of conventional military operations. What the Mexican military, I think, clearly can do is patrol its territory, patrol Mexican airspace, control Mexican waters, and to deal with rebellions and insurgencies when they arise, because they do arise from time to time. And of course, nowadays, they're also very much involved in the war against the drug cartels. Okay, so part two, what does this mean for Mexican military requirements? Given that the Mexican military, more or less since the beginning, is focused on internal security, it stands to reason that it only needs capabilities that would enable it to play a domestic security role. If we were to sit down with just a blank piece of paper and imagine what kind of force a country like Mexico would need, I think the list would include you need large because you need to control and cover a large space, a large but relatively low-tech army that's geared for the lower end of the conflict spectrum. You don't need to fight the Ukraine war or anything like that. It needs an air force with good transport capabilities, moving people around. Remember, Mexico's a large country. Also, it should have some very good, ideally close air support capabilities and ISR capabilities, and maybe a little bit of air-to-air capability, but not a lot, because it's not about having air battles against other people's air forces. It's more about being able to shoot down bad guys, because the bad guys, like the drug cartels, do actually have aircraft to do things with. It doesn't need to be able to strike any place outside of Mexico's borders. In fact, that's probably a bad idea, because if you have the ability to project force outside of Mexico, that might get the attention of the Americans. So you don't want to actually do that. And as for naval capabilities, Mexico clearly does not need anything more than you would get from a robust Coast Guard. So the Mexican Navy, therefore, is really far more comparable to the United States Coast Guard than it is to the United States Navy. The Mexicans don't need to fight big fleet actions on the high seas. They don't even need any kind of je ne sais sort of approach to dealing with enemy fleets, because the only adversary fleet, the only fleet that matters off Mexican waters, is the United States Navy, and there's really no point in worrying about the United States Navy. The United States Navy will do what it wants to do off Mexican waters, and that's just a fact of life. Now, if you made it this far in this video, please remember to hit like and subscribe. And if you really feel so inspired, please feel free to send me some money, either through, there's a thanks button here on YouTube. You can also become a member. And if you become a member, this basically guarantees that you're one of the coolest people on the planet. And for those of you who already signed up as members, thank you very much. It is extremely helpful for my channel and enabling me to keep doing this. Also, you can buy me a coffee through the Buy Me a Coffee link that is below in the description. It's extremely helpful. So anyways, okay, so part three. Let's go over the Mexican military and look at what they have. I think that you're going to find that by and large the Mexican military is actually rather appropriate, sort of fit for purpose given Mexico's actual requirements. Let's focus first on the army. The Mexican army is large. I read that they have about 260,000 men and women in it on active duty. They're also reservists, but I was not able to get precise numbers about how many reservists there actually are. Because reserves are usually for wartime mobilization, but that's not something that Mexico actually needs, because they're not planning to be able to go to war against any other country. The Mexican army, understandably, is infantry heavy. Its main maneuver units consist of 10 infantry brigades. They are divided among 3 army corps and around 12 regional military regions. So there's this very clear geographic distribution. And all of these are further divided into 48 military zones. Again, this is all about internal defense. There also are 3 special forces brigades and various special forces units with different statuses and at different levels. Also, the Mexican army has 9 artillery regiments. These are spread out amongst the different military zones. They're independent of the infantry brigades, but they coordinate and they operate in close coordination with the infantry brigades. The Mexican army operates a large and diverse fleet of armored vehicles, most of which probably would be considered museum pieces in other countries. These include French AMX VCI and ERC 90s, both of which have been retired from the French army, as well as the VBL, which I believe the French are now trying to retire from their force. The Mexicans also operate the venerable DN5 Toro, the HWK 11, and the ancient Mix-Mac, or Mix-Mac 1, whatever that is. Anyways, plus lots and lots of Humvees. Of the more modern vehicles in the Mexican fleet, one finds the Israeli Plasan Sandcat, and the DN-11. Mexico also recently placed a large order for Emirati-made Cobra 4. They don't have any main battle tanks, which I think is, of course, fine because they're not going to war against other armies. Not only that, but they don't have much with respect to anti-armor capabilities. I read that the Mexicans have some French Milan anti-tank systems, most of which are mounted on the 40 VBL vehicles, or the VBL M11 vehicles, which apparently are sort of Milan platforms. They also, I've read, have some RPG-7s and some American law missiles, but I don't know how many or how well they're integrated into the overall order of battle. The Mexicans do not possess javelins or spikes or Acherons or cornets or any of the other sort of like high-end modern anti-tank guided missiles. The Milan, I think it's like a 1970s or 1980s technology. It follows that the Mexican army has no MLRS, nor does it have any 155 millimeter howitzers. They have a variety of 105 millimeter howitzers, a few self-propelled, but mostly towed. And I think they have a variety of mortars, some self-propelled, but mostly towed, including 120 millimeter mortars, which are either French F1s or Israeli Sultan K6 mortars. The Army also has some old school anti-aircraft guns, which nowadays people are beginning to rethink and realize that actually they're more valuable. So yay, Mexico. I mean, they're valuable for dealing with drone threats. They also have very limited anti-air capabilities beyond these old guns. So, for instance, they have some Igla man pads, but they don't have anything like Patriots or even sort of old Cold War era Hawks. I mean, maybe this is for fear of making the U.S. nervous or something like that. I don't know. Or maybe just the reality that, like, except for drones, maybe they don't really have a need for, remember, they don't have to worry about shooting down attacking enemy aircraft, and you certainly don't want the Americans to think that you could do this, because then that would be very dangerous. Let's turn now to the Mexican Air Force. Mexico's Air Force weighs in at about 50 to 60,000 people. I've read maybe 30,500 active, 20 to 30,000 reserve, which seems like a large number, but anyways, that's what I found. Now, as you might expect, the Mexican Air Force has a respectable fleet of transport, fixed and rotary-winged aircraft ranging from, they have 3 C-130s. I just read that they just placed an order for 2 more C-130Js. They also have Cessnas and different American, European, and Russian helicopters. In terms of combat power, there's not much. The pillar of the Mexican Air Force really is its fleet of 63 Swiss-made Pilatus PC-7 airplanes. These are training aircraft that the Mexicans in the 1990s adapted and turned into light attack aircraft. And I've heard that this got them into trouble with the Swiss. The Swiss objected to what they were doing because this violated the end user agreement, and then they've blocked all further exports of the Pilatus aircraft to Mexico. Now, while the PC-7 might not be my pick for light attack aircraft, in fact, I would definitely go for other light attack aircraft, I presume it does the job, and frankly, this is precisely this kind of combat aircraft that Mexico really needs. So this is a good idea. What Mexico is missing is any decent air-to-air capability. It has no modern combat jets. What it does have is a fleet of 3 or 4 ancient F-5E fighters that were last modernized in the early 2000s. It's not clear at all if they're still operable, if they still fly. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. You don't need F-35s, you don't need Eurofighters, you don't need Rafale. You just need some sort of serviceable fighter jet that's relatively easy to maintain and keep in the air and has some, decent radars and some air-to-air capability. Second-hand F-16s would do the job extremely well. If those aren't available, maybe they should look into the Korean F-A-50s. Gripens already might even be overkill, but they would certainly do the job. Now, the good news is that Mexico does operate 3 Embraer R99 aircraft, 1 in an airborne early warning configuration and 2 in maritime patrol configurations. I'm sure these are extremely useful. Probably they should have more of them, because basically what Mexico needs above all is to be able to monitor space, monitor the airspace, monitor the borders, that sort of thing. And these Embraers are excellent for that. Turning to the Mexican Navy is actually much larger than I had imagined it would be. Now, understandably, the Mexican Navy is not designed for fleet actions on the high seas or any kind of generical defense against powerful militaries. I expect or suspect that Mexican naval thinkers, to the extent that they have any, and I really have no idea, I suspect that they understand that going out of their way not to contest the United States Navy's dominance is a far safer thing to do than anything that might be construed as contesting the United States Navy's dominance. But what the Mexican Navy does possess is an impressive fleet of patrol vessels of various kinds and aircraft of various kinds, and they also have what might be described as amphibious assault craft. At the higher end of the spectrum is one new Dutch-built Reformador class frigate, of which 7 more are in order. These have some anti-air capabilities. They also have Harpoon anti-ship missiles. Mexico also has 2 Huracan missile boats, which are second-hand Israeli Navy gunboats, possibly armed with Gabriel anti-ship missiles. Then comes a fleet of at least 44 patrol craft of various classes and kinds and sizes. And as far as I can tell, interestingly enough, none of Mexico's ships, except for the Reformador and maybe the 2 ex-Israeli Navy's ships, have anti-ship missiles. The rest basically have guns, cannons, and 50 caliber machine guns. I'm not sure, about those Israeli boats. From what I understand, when they were in Israeli service, they had both Harpoons and Gabriels. The Israelis certainly removed the Harpoons. Probably they needed to do so for the sake of the, ITAR and the end user agreement that they had with the Americans, because those are American missiles. But it's not clear. They may or may not have removed the Gabriel, and I haven't seen anything definitive on that subject. Perhaps the sexiest boats in the Mexican fleet are its 48 Swedish CB-90 fast assault craft. These are highly maneuverable, low draft, high speed boats. They do, I think, 40 knots, and they're designed to carry infantry to shore. They're excellent. The Mexican Navy also operates 18 maritime patrol craft and about 22 transport aircraft, plus a mixed fleet of 43 utility helicopters. Turning briefly to the Mexican Marine Corps, yes, they have a Marine Corps, which weighs in at about 38,000 men and women. It's part of Mexico's Navy, which regards them as, or technically they're called the Naval Infantry. The Mexican Navy Special Forces, which do exist, are part of the Marine Corps. I get the impression that while the Army has some high-speed units, the Marine Corps is predominantly high-speed units, and thus it provides Mexico with some of its high-speed, fast intervention, reconnaissance capabilities. Just sort of it's sort of the pointy end of the stick, if you will, for the Mexican government. Historically, they've been associated with port security and amphibious operations, but in recent years, they've been playing a larger role in the drug war, the counter narcotics operations, even inland. I actually became aware of them when I was on vacation this year, near Cancun, and I saw Mexican Marines patrolling beaches, and I thought, who are they? What are they? How interesting. Just as a side note, in 2005, the Mexican Marines deployed to New Orleans to help respond to Hurricane Katrina. And here's a photo of George Walker Bush thanking the Mexican Marines in the streets of New Orleans, which is just, I love sort of, you can savor that, the idea of Mexican troops being in the United States to help the Americans, because the Americans actually needed the help. It's wonderful. Anyways, the part 4, let's wrap it all up and bring it together. Mexico is a case of a country that has real security concerns, but it has renounced making any effort to secure itself from the one country that threatens it the most, which is the United States, largely because it can't, and because they've figured out that the safest way to protect itself from the United States is to be as unprovocative and untempting a target as possible. Thus, the Mexicans largely have eschewed any kind of real conventional military capabilities. They focus instead on things that are very clearly capabilities aligned with internal security and internal defense, and dealing with things like indigenous insurgencies, or now the drug wars, which is a very different sort of thing from fighting other military. So they have no peer-to-peer capabilities, nor do they want peer-to-peer capabilities, because peer-to-peer having those are more dangerous for Mexico than not having them. From this point of view, I would argue that Mexico's military actually makes a great deal of sense. Now, I can't judge their competence. I don't know how good they are. I'm guessing that it's a mix of good and bad. Like many militaries, there's some good units and bad units. I'm also guessing that the average Mexican soldier probably knows his trade, but I don't really know. What I can say is that in terms of the Mexican military's force structure and capabilities, the Mexican military seems to have the right stuff and in the right quantities. Now, if Mexico's president, Claudia Sheinbaum, were to call me and ask about the military and say, Michael, she'd say, Michael, what are we missing? What do we need? I would say that, first of all, I think Mexico would benefit very clearly from surveillance drones, large and small, and possibly some armed drones. Like the Turkish TB2s, and that these armed drones would complement well Mexican light attack aircraft. And speaking of those light attack aircraft, I would argue that while the PC-7s maybe do the job, PC-7s are not really made to be light attack aircraft. They're designed to be training aircraft, and maybe Mexico would be better served with aircraft that are purpose-built for the role, like the Embraer Super Tucano. Super Tucano are vastly superior to PC-7s for that kind of close air support role, which Mexico needs more than anything. And a combined fleet of TB2s and Super Tucanos, I think, would be extremely powerful and extremely effective and at relatively low cost. I also think that Mexico probably needs more air-to-air capabilities. I certainly think that if those F-5s are still being maintained, they should stop, because those are just money pits at this point. So stop doing that. Get rid of the F-5s, put them in museums where they belong. Now, either have no combat jets or go and try to get yourself some used F-16s or some Korean planes, something with decent, respectable air-to-air capabilities. Again, not because they're going to get into dogfights with enemy fighter planes, but just so that they can patrol the skies and they can down aircraft, drug cartel aircraft as required. Otherwise, I would wish Sheinbaum, I would congratulate her and say, carry on. And I would wish her luck managing President Trump, because the wars that Sheinbaum has to worry about most are a trade war with the United States and the drug wars against the Mexican cartels. And as she knows, the more dangerous the cartels become, the greater the possibility that the United States will intervene, which is something that she absolutely does not want to happen. Thank you very much. If you like this video, please again hit like and subscribe. Also check out in the description. There are links to my LinkedIn, Twitter, and Blue Sky account, as well as to my weekly Substack, which is also called Pax Americana. And then last but not least, my own website, michaelshurkin.com. There's plenty more in the pipeline, so please watch the space, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Bye-bye.